Medieval Christmas was a world far removed from our modern holiday. Picture a grand hall in the home of a noble, decorated not with Christmas trees, but with lavish tapestries and lit by candles. There are no sparkling lights or the scent of pine filling the air. Instead, the room would have been full of people preparing for a festival unlike any other. For 12 days, the entire society would shift into a different rhythm, a time where the usual rules were tossed aside. This period of festive chaos, known as Twelvetide, stretched from December 25th through January 6th, and for people in the Middle Ages, it was a time of feasts, rituals, and revelry that stood in stark contrast to the more somber seasons of the year. Society would look different, and even the clergy would break their usual behavior. Imagine lower-ranked priests dressing up as bishops, young men wearing goatskin masks, and society's usual rules getting thrown out the window. But why did this happen? What was the purpose of this seeming madness? Across medieval Europe, Christmas had a shared pattern, though each region added its own unique twist. At the core of this celebration was the liturgy, the religious observance that set the tone for the entire season. The period of Advent, which began in late November, led up to Christmas Day and was marked by fasting, where meat and dairy were avoided in favor of fish and vegetables. For weeks, the body was deprived of the rich foods it typically enjoyed. Then, when Christmas finally arrived, it was like an explosion of food, especially proteins that the common folk would rarely taste. For peasants and workers, the Christmas feast meant a break from the scarcity they often faced. They could eat meats like beef, pork, and even exotic foods, depending on their status. This was more than just a holiday of indulgence. It was a spiritual moment. By 350 A.D., Pope Julius I had officially declared December 25th as the Western Christmas date, marking it as a significant day in the Christian calendar. But the medieval period took this a step further. From December 25th through January 6th, the 12 days of Christmas became known as Twelvetide, each day holding its own specific meaning and celebration. The 26th honored Saint Stephen, the first Christian martyr, while the 27th paid tribute to Saint John the Evangelist. December 28th, the Feast of the Holy Innocents, commemorated the babies killed by King Herod's order. These days were more than just dates on a calendar. They were moments steeped in religious and cultural meaning. But there was also something special about how the Church observed Christmas Day itself. On Christmas Day, priests had the rare privilege of celebrating not one but 3 masses, each at a different time of day. The first, the Angel's Mass, occurred at midnight, filled with the mystery and wonder of Christ's birth, celebrated in candlelight and darkness. At dawn, the Shepherd's Mass would follow, symbolizing the humble visitors who came to see the newborn Savior. Finally, in full daylight, the King's Mass would be held, offering a more grand and public celebration. These 3 masses weren't just rituals. They each addressed a different theological aspect of Christ's incarnation, from his humble birth to his recognition as the King of Kings. This form of worship captured the essence of the holy day in a way that was both personal and communal. But the feasts were just as important as the masses. Christmas was a time for eating, and it wasn't just any meal, it was a contractual obligation. On the estates of the wealthy, such as in Somerset, shepherds and tenants were promised a feast on Christmas Eve. For example, a shepherd's contract might include bread, meat, and even ale to drink. In some cases, tenants were provided with a generous spread: 2 loaves of bread, beef mixed with bacon and mustard, a chicken, cheese, and plenty of beer. The nature of the feast would change depending on one's rank in society, but the message was clear. Christmas was a time for indulgence, a chance for people to enjoy what they normally couldn't afford or access. For the nobility, it was a time to show off their wealth and generosity, serving extravagant meals to guests and servants alike. Gifts, too, were exchanged, though not on Christmas Day itself. This might be a surprise to many, but in medieval Europe, gifts were traditionally given on New Year's Day, not December 25th. King Henry Roman III of England, for instance, bought over 300 rings to distribute on January 1st. In 1242, he even gifted Beatrice of Savoy a set of precious stones that cost a staggering £100, an astronomical amount for the time. This tradition wasn't just about wealth or show. It reflected the idea of renewal and hope that New Year's represented. While Christmas was a time for feasting, New Year's was a moment for giving and receiving, marking the passage of time and the promise of what was to come. Let's take a closer look at how Christmas was celebrated in different regions, as the traditions varied widely across medieval Europe. In England, the holiday was filled with spectacle. One of the most famous elements of the celebration was the arrival of the boar's head, carried into the great hall in a procession. The boar was often adorned with rosemary and bay, sometimes even gilded to give it a more regal look. It wasn't just about the food. It was a theatrical moment, a dramatic focal point that the household would celebrate with music and song. Servants would carry the boar through the hall as guests sang the boar's head carol, creating a lively atmosphere that mixed the sacred with the festive. This was part of a larger tradition of mummings, where people dressed in masks or animal skins and went from house to house. They would enter a home without ceremony, and the household was expected to feed them, otherwise they risked public shame. These mummers were often young men who took on roles that allowed them to break social norms and engage in the kind of behavior that would have been forbidden at any other time of year. In France, the celebration had a different character. The Feast of Fools, held on New Year's Day, was a central event in French medieval Christmas celebrations. The twist here was that lower-ranking clergy would take on the roles of bishops and priests, reversing the usual hierarchy of the church. By the mid-1400s, French records described scenes where priests wore masks and even danced in the choir, defying the solemnity of their roles. In some cases, priests were even known to perform ridiculous acts, such as eating black puddings or playing dice during Mass. These actions, often considered sacrilegious by outsiders, were part of the humor and irreverence that defined the French Christmas celebration. Though some church officials tried to suppress these antics, such as the Council of Basel's 1435 ban on the Feast of Fools, the tradition continued for centuries. It was a moment of chaos where social norms were bent and humor reigned supreme, much to the delight of the people who participated. Meanwhile, in Italy, Christmas took on a more spiritual tone, especially with the creation of the nativity scene. St. Francis of Assisi, in December of 1223, created the first recorded nativity scene in a cave at Grexio. This was no ordinary display. He used real animals, including a donkey and an ox, and filled a manger with hay to make the scene as realistic as possible. St. Francis's goal was clear. He wanted to bring the story of Christ's birth to life in a way that even the illiterate peasants could understand. This new tradition spread quickly, with references to nativity scenes appearing in Rome by 1272 and in Naples by 1343. By the end of the Middle Ages, nativity scenes had expanded to include figures of Mary, Joseph, the shepherds, and musicians, creating a detailed and emotional portrayal of the Holy Family's story. This was Italy's unique contribution to medieval Christmas, a devotion that focused on intimate, visual storytelling. In Spain, Christmas was celebrated with a special midnight mass called the Missa del Gallo, or Mass of the Rooster. The nobility would attend this service in the middle of the night, braving the cold and the dark to mark the sacred moment of Christ's birth. This service was an act of devotion and sacrifice, emphasizing the importance of the occasion despite the inconvenience it caused. Another significant day in Spain was December 28th, known as Dia de los Santos Inocentes, or Holy Innocents' Day. This day was essentially a festival of pranks, where people played jokes on one another, much like the modern day April Fool's Day. It was a light-hearted way of bringing humor to the season and reflected the underlying theme of chaos that marked medieval Christmas celebrations. Each region's celebration of Christmas revealed something about their society's values and traditions, blending religious observance with festive indulgence. These celebrations were not just about the birth of Christ. They were also about communal participation, shared experiences, and the breaking of social norms. The holiday became a space where the rules could be bent, a time to indulge in the excesses that were normally reserved for the wealthy, and a chance for everyone, regardless of status, to join in the revelry. It was a complex tapestry of traditions that varied from place to place, but were united by the overarching spirit of Christmas. In the medieval world, Christmas was not just a day, but a stretch of 12 days, each imbued with its own meaning, rituals, and traditions. These 12 days were collectively known as Twelvetide, a period when social structures were temporarily upended and the rigid boundaries between classes became blurred. For a brief time, it seemed as though the rules of everyday life were suspended. The nobility, the clergy, and the common people all participated in various ways, often side by side. But the feasts, the religious observances, and the sometimes bizarre behaviors of these 12 days reveal a deep cultural tradition that went beyond the simple idea of Christmas as we know it today. One of the most striking features of this period was how much of it was framed by a religious calendar. The medieval Christmas season wasn't just about the birth of Christ. It was a reflection of the sacred calendar, intertwined with both feast and fasting. Advent, the season of waiting before Christmas, had already set a solemn tone. As the days of fasting drew to a close, Christmas itself burst forth like a feast of joy. For many people, especially in rural communities, the 12 days were filled with blessings they would otherwise never experience, such as meats, wine, and sweet pastries. These foods, seen as luxuries during the rest of the year, were suddenly abundant. The rhythm of the 12 days of Christmas created a sense of anticipation. Each day had its own significance and was celebrated in different ways across Europe. December 25th, of course, was the day of the Nativity, the birth of Christ. But as the 12 days unfolded, each one was devoted to a saint or a key event, reminding people that this was not merely a time of indulgence, but also a time for reflection and reverence. By the time you reached December 28th, things had shifted. Dia de los Santos Inocentes, or the Feast of the Holy Innocents, celebrated on this day, was not a somber occasion, but an occasion for play and jokes, a feast for children and the young at heart. It was a day of pranks, where the usual social order was temporarily overturned and mischief ruled. In the church, there was often little ceremony or pomp. But outside in the towns and villages, people played tricks on each other. It's difficult to imagine in today's world that a day meant to honor the tragic loss of young lives could be transformed into one of laughter and disorder. Yet, in the medieval world, this was not unusual. The juxtaposition of sacred and secular made the medieval Christmas unique. It was both a time of devotion and a moment for societal release. But perhaps the most unusual and entertaining of these traditions was the Feast of Fools, which was popular in France. This event typically fell around New Year's Day and was a prime example of how medieval society found moments for sheer chaos. During this celebration, the social hierarchy was intentionally inverted. It was a day when lower clergy would dress as bishops and priests and take on the roles of their superiors. In some towns, mock masses were celebrated, where everything sacred was turned into a parody. Some priests even went so far as to engage in outrageous behavior, dancing in the choir, singing bawdy songs, and even gambling during Mass. The idea was that for one day, the poor and the lowly could experience a taste of the power and prestige usually reserved for the rich and the religious elite. This inversion of roles was a temporary escape from the rigid feudal hierarchy that marked medieval society. The Feast of Fools wasn't just confined to the clergy, it permeated the entire community. The high-spirited atmosphere extended beyond the church walls, spilling into homes and towns. In villages and cities alike, mummers and masqueraders would visit homes masked and disguised. It was a tradition that blurred the lines between the sacred and the ridiculous. When mummers arrived, they didn't ask permission. They simply entered, and the hosts were expected to feed them. To refuse was to risk public humiliation. Mumming was a way of breaking down social barriers, an act of role reversal that allowed people to bypass the usual protocols of class and etiquette. It was a rare moment when the social order became less rigid, and a sense of communal unity was felt, even if just for a day. This blend of sacred and secular traditions did not stop with the Feast of Fools. In fact, Christmas itself was a complex festival that wove together deeply religious observances with deeply secular customs. In Italy, for example, the focus shifted toward devotion through sight. Instead of chaos and revelry, the people of Italy celebrated the Nativity in a very personal and intimate way. This is where the idea of the nativity scene, or presepio, originated. Saint Francis of Assisi in 1223 set up the first recorded nativity scene in the town of Grexio. But this was no mere decoration. It was a dramatic moment with real animals, a manger filled with hay, and living figures to recreate the sacred scene. The idea behind this was simple. For those who were illiterate or unable to read the scriptures, the nativity scene would bring the story of Christ's birth to life in a way they could understand. This devotional visualization of Christ's birth soon spread throughout Italy. In the 13th and 14th centuries, it evolved from a simple scene in a barn to elaborate displays that included Mary, Joseph, the baby Jesus, the shepherds, and even angels. By the end of the Middle Ages, the presepe had become a staple of Italian Christmas celebrations, with some families dedicating entire rooms to these intricate, detailed scenes. They were designed to evoke a deep sense of reverence and connection with the Nativity, unlike the boisterous celebrations in other parts of Europe. Italy's Christmas traditions leaned toward the intimate and reflective, inviting people to contemplate the meaning of the season in a quiet, personal way. Meanwhile, across the Low Countries and in Germany, traditions around Christmas took on more festive and theatrical forms. In the Low Countries, Sinterklaas, the precursor to the modern-day Santa Claus, was a key figure in early December. On his feast day, children would leave shoes by the hearth, hoping to find small gifts or coins left by St. Nicholas, who checked on their behavior throughout the year. The tradition of anonymous charity that came from Sinterklaas gift giving would later evolve into our modern-day practices of holiday gifting, but for medieval people, this simple exchange became an important symbol of generosity and goodwill. In Germany, the celebrations became more theatrical with the creation of the Paradise Play. On December 24th, churches would stage dramatic depictions of the fall of man, complete with an evergreen tree decorated with red apples and wafers, representing the tree of knowledge. This was the precursor to the modern Christmas tree, which eventually became a staple of Christmas celebrations in the 19th century. The Paradise Tree, as it was called, symbolized both the fall of man and the redemption through Christ's birth, creating a bridge between pagan and Christian traditions. What started as a simple dramatic play about Adam and Eve eventually evolved into a larger celebration of light and hope, especially during the darkest time of the year. Additionally, Germany was the birthplace of what would become the modern Christmas market. Originally, these markets were meat markets where people gathered to buy provisions for the winter months. Over time, they evolved into festive gatherings selling everything from toys to Lebkuchen, honey, spice cakes invented by Franconian monks in the 13th century. These markets, which began in the medieval period, were a way for townspeople to come together, celebrate, and prepare for the long, harsh winter. As these markets grew, so did the Christmas spirit, blending both the need for survival and the joy of community celebration. The evolution of Christmas during the medieval period reveals much about the changing nature of medieval society, particularly when it came to the interaction between church and tradition. For much of the early Middle Ages, Christmas was, in its most sacred form, a religious observance dictated by the Church. Early medieval Christians, from around 400 to 1000 AD, focused largely on ecclesiastical observance, a time dedicated to spiritual reflection and religious services. This was the time of year when the Church's role in people's lives was at its strongest. It was a period of solemnity where the medieval Christian world saw Advent as a time of preparation and fasting, leading up to the sacred moment of Christ's birth. However, over the centuries, Christmas evolved. By the time the 11th and 12th centuries arrived, Christmas had become far more theatrical in nature. Mystery plays emerged, turning sacred stories into dramatic performances. These plays, performed in churches, depicted everything from the Nativity to scenes of biblical significance, adding a layer of public participation that hadn't existed before. While the Church remained at the center of this transformation, it was clear that society was blending religious observance with entertainment, making the Christmas festival not just a time for quiet reflection, but also a community event that engaged people of all social ranks. The rise of mystery plays gave birth to a new form of communal expression. These plays were not just about acting out religious tales for the sake of devotion. They also became an opportunity for medieval people to engage in public rituals and create a sense of shared experience. The performances blurred the lines between sacred worship and popular entertainment, and the feasts and celebrations that accompanied them allowed everyone, from the nobility to the peasants, to participate in the joy of the season. In the 13th century, the presepe or nativity scenes became a part of this transformation, particularly in Italy, where Saint Francis of Assisi introduced the idea of creating an immersive nativity. This wasn't just a religious display, it was a visual and emotional connection to the sacred story. The presepe would evolve into art installations with realistic figures that brought the Christmas story into the homes of the faithful. Yet, even as these religious traditions grew in size and complexity, they didn't completely overshadow the festive chaos that characterized the medieval Christmas. In many ways, the period was defined by a tension between order and disorder. Medieval society, with its rigid feudal hierarchy, depended on order to maintain its structure. However, Christmas, a festival that invited the temporary suspension of social norms, acted as a form of release. This was most clearly expressed in the Feast of Fools, celebrated across Europe. France, in particular, embraced this tradition in a grand way, turning the Christmas season into a wild carnival of role reversal, where the lower clergy dressed as bishops, performed mock rituals, and participated in disorderly behavior. The very existence of such festivals suggested that even in an age of strict societal norms, people still needed moments of chaos, times when the pressure of daily life could be momentarily lifted, and the established order could be turned on its head. The Feast of Fools wasn't just about comedy and laughter. It also represented the tension between the religious and secular aspects of Christmas. While the Church focused on solemn religious observance, these unruly celebrations showcased how the people of the Middle Ages used humor and mockery to process the harsh realities of their lives. For example, in France, the lower clergy would take on the roles of bishops, and the whole church could become a stage for social satire. This inversion of roles allowed the poor and working class to experience a brief moment of power. They could be the ones with the authority for a day, and in doing so, they asserted their humanity and dignity within a society that often left them voiceless. Meanwhile, in Italy, another aspect of Christmas began to take root, one that didn't lean so heavily on revelry and chaos, but on devotion. Italy's approach to Christmas moved away from the wild, energetic celebrations of the North and focused more on visual devotion. The nativity scene, or presepio, became central to this new way of experiencing Christmas. This tradition, which started with Saint Francis of Assisi, began as a simple effort to help people feel emotionally connected to the Christmas story, a way of bringing the Nativity to life for those who could not read or understand the Scripture. The presepio expanded in size and complexity over the centuries, becoming elaborate displays of Mary, Joseph, the Christ child, and a host of angels, shepherds, and animals. These scenes became a deeply personal way for people to engage with the story of Christ's birth, and eventually they would become a central feature of the Italian holiday season. The presepio also symbolized a shift in medieval thinking about Christmas. Devotion through sight rather than sound was emphasized, and people found themselves experiencing the sacred through visual representation rather than participation in loud celebrations or chaotic festivals. The goal of these nativity scenes was not just to commemorate the birth of Christ, but to create a peaceful reflection on the true meaning of the season. In this way, Italy's contribution to the medieval Christmas was a meditative, almost spiritual, counterbalance to the louder, more rowdy traditions found elsewhere in Europe. As we look at these various Christmas traditions, whether it's the Feast of Fools in France or the nativity scenes in Italy, it becomes clear that medieval Christmas was a time when society was able to express itself in a multitude of ways. These diverse traditions were often a reaction to the very rigid structure of medieval life. Social mobility was limited, and the divisions between the nobility and the common people were often oppressive. Christmas offered a rare opportunity to break down these barriers, even if just for a short period, through gift giving, feasts, and even role reversals. Medieval people were able to experience a taste of equality and freedom, even if it was just symbolic. But this is not to say that medieval Christmas was solely about chaos and subversion. It was also a time of community. In Germany, for example, the Christmas market was not just about selling goods. It was about creating a shared experience. Originally, these markets were meat markets where townspeople gathered to buy provisions for the winter months, but over time they became celebrations filled with music, food, and drink. The Striezelmarkt in Dresden, which dates back to 1434, is one of the oldest Christmas markets in the world and exemplifies the transformation of the holiday into a communal event. These markets were a place where people came together not only to buy goods, but to celebrate the coming of Christmas, creating an atmosphere of joy and hope. In this way, medieval Christmas was a complex blend of devotion and disorder, reflection and revelry. It was a time when society could come together to celebrate, express their devotion, and at times even subvert the order that governed their daily lives. It was a moment when the spiritual and secular coexisted, and through this combination, medieval Christmas became much more than just a religious festival. It was an expression of society's needs, both its desire for structure and its longing for freedom, reverence, and joy. The significance of medieval Christmas lies not just in the celebration of Christ's birth, but in the way it reflected the complex social structure and values of medieval society. In an age where rigid hierarchies governed every aspect of life, Christmas provided a temporary release from this pressure. The rituals, feasts, and festivals that defined Twelvetide were a pressure valve, allowing people from all walks of life, nobles, clergy, peasants, and tradespeople alike, to experience a moment of freedom. It was a time when the normal rules of society were suspended and the natural order of things could be upended. At the heart of this was the concept of misrule. Medieval Christmas wasn't merely a joyful occasion, it was an opportunity for the common folk to temporarily usurp the roles of the nobility and the clergy. The Feast of Fools was perhaps the most extreme expression of this idea. For one day, the lowly peasants could become bishops, priests, and even kings, freely mocking the higher-ups who usually controlled their lives. Gambling during Mass, dancing in the church, and role reversals all served to punctuate the festival's sense of rebellion. The Feast of Fools wasn't just about chaos, it was about recognition. It gave the poor a moment to be seen, to be heard, and to show their worth in a society that often ignored them. For these fleeting days, they had a place at the table where social division was temporarily erased. Yet, as much as these chaotic festivals reflected a desire for freedom, they also served as a safety valve for the broader feudal system. By giving people a taste of equality and release, these customs allowed them to express their frustrations and desires without threatening the stability of the social order for the rest of the year. By making the festival official, the Church could maintain control over the spiritual aspects of Christmas while allowing the lower classes to indulge in their brief moments of self-expression. This balance kept the peace, avoiding more significant challenges to the status quo and keeping the elite and clergy in their positions of power. As the medieval world transitioned into the Renaissance and beyond, these traditions would slowly lose their potency. The rise of the Reformation in the 16th century would challenge many of the excesses of Christmas celebrations, particularly in regions where Protestantism spread. The new Protestant mindset rejected the festive chaos of Christmas, seeing it as a pagan holdover that distracted from the true meaning of the holiday, the birth of Christ. Yet, the Reformation itself would eventually inspire new forms of celebration, albeit more reserved and centered on family and religion rather than the riotous social inversion that had once characterized the season. Despite these changes, medieval Christmas remains a reflection of a time when ritual and community were intricately tied to social cohesion. The 12 days of celebration were not just about feasting and revelry. They were a way of unifying society. They reflected the collective needs of a people who lived under harsh conditions, but found moments of joy and connection through shared traditions. These traditions weren't just about indulgence. They were about belonging, and in an age of survival, that sense of belonging was everything. In the centuries that followed, modern Christmas would evolve into the family-centered, commercialized holiday we know today. The chaos of the medieval Christmas faded into memory, replaced by the familiar trappings of gift-giving, decorated trees, and Santa Claus. Yet, the underlying principles of community, celebration, and reflection that defined medieval Christmas continue to influence how we experience the holiday today. Though the excesses of the past have given way to a more controlled form of celebration, the universal themes, joy, generosity, and the coming together of people, still echo in our modern observances. In many ways, medieval Christmas was a microcosm of medieval society itself. It was a time when, for a brief moment, the tensions between order and disorder, devotion and festivity, rich and poor could be suspended. It was a time when society could be united not just by faith, but by the shared experience of the season. These moments, as chaotic and unruly as they were an essential part of medieval life, creating a sense of hope and renewal that went beyond the religious observance of Christ's birth. Today, we may celebrate Christmas in different ways, but the deep need for community and connection remains at the heart of the holiday, just as it did in medieval times.